You are now listening to Protecting Your Nest with board-certified family medicine and obesity medicine specialist Dr. Tony Hampton. For more, visit drtonyhampton.com. Welcome to Protecting Your Nest. Most of the decisions that determine what we eat are made by dietary guidelines. It impacts the school lunch programs, the WIC program, the military, and what's on the menu in the hospitals, including the dietary advice you receive from your clinician or dietitian. Most clinicians never question these guidelines since there's an assumption that they are created based on evidence that's the best available. That assumption has likely caused many medical professionals to continue to recommend this dietary advice, even when they see evidence that their patients are not caring, or should I say, receiving the type of response they expect. In other words, that response is metabolic health. Then, in 2007, along comes my guest, Gary Taubes, and his book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, where Gary tries to end the long-held belief that a low-fat diet was best at promoting weight loss and better health. Obesity is caused, he argues, not by the quantity of calories you eat, but by the quality of those calories. Carbohydrates in particular raises insulin levels and promote the storage of fat. Only 7 years later, in 2014, another journalist, Nina Teicholz, in her book, The Big Fat Surprise, brought further clarity to the topic. She clarified that everything we thought we knew about dietary fat was wrong. She documents how the past 60 years of low-fat nutrition advice has amounted to a vast, uncontrolled experiment on the entire population with disastrous consequences for our health. Her conclusion, like Gary's, is that the path to metabolic health is to get to its root cause. We now know that excessive carbohydrate consumption is the root cause of poor metabolic health for most Americans and for those in other parts of the world. Imagine that. The nutrition world rocked, not by the scientists who work in the lab or the curious doc like myself at the local clinic, but two investigative journalists whose journalistic intuition was exactly what was needed to get us on the right path, the path of healing. So with that, I've already had the pleasure of interviewing Nina Teicholz, but today we have the pleasure of a conversation with Gary Taubes. Gary is an award-winning scientist and health journalist and co-founder and director of Nutrition Science Initiative. He has a project out, and that's that book called The Case for Keto. But in addition to that book, in addition to that Good Calories, Bad Calories book, he also wrote The Case for Against Sugar and Why We Get Fat. He's also a former staff writer for Discovery and a correspondent for Science, and he graduated from Harvard in 1977 with a degree in physics, and he also received an MS degree from engineering at Stanford University in 1978 or so. So, Gary, I really want to welcome you to Protecting the Nest. I know you're in a nicer place, which is Oakland, California, but welcome and thank you for being here today.
Tony, thank you for having me. It's great to get to meet you in person, or sort of in person.
I've been looking forward to it. Yeah, we've been, we kind of see each other on Twitter and now, see each other in person. It's really a great opportunity, but I am jealous. I actually looked at my phone before we started, and it was for Chicago, it was about 23 degrees, and in Oakland, 63 degrees. So I'm like, I prefer to be where you are. So yeah, I appreciate that.
That's why we moved out here.
Yeah.
But
well, you may have a neighbor soon, because
okay. Although you guys don't have active earthquake fault running a half mile from your house, and you don't have the forest fires that So we'll see how this plays out.
My mom reminds me of that often. So every time I bring up, San Diego or whatever. So I'm with you on that. So I want to start by thinking about, the impact you and Nina Teicholz have made in the world of nutrition science. And I think that's something that we can't question. It's been impactful. So I'm curious if you and Nina collaborate at all. And I'm also curious, just being a writer, what kind of insights do you think being a writer has had that allowed you to see the world through a different lens, a lens that many people couldn't see until you guys wrote your books?
Okay, well, the first question, I first met Nina when I lived in Manhattan. So she was living on the Upper West Side. I was living down in Greenwich Village. She was starting her book and interviewed me, and we became good friends and would get together, once a month for lunch and discuss these topics. Our spouses pretty quickly got tired of hearing words like carbohydrates and fats, so we needed someone, extramaritally to talk to about these subjects. And we've been good friends ever since. And in fact, she grew up out here in Berkeley. So when she visits her parents, I see her out here. And when I visit my wife's parents in Westchester, New York, in the suburbs, we'll get together in New York. I think the advantage of there's a few advantages here. First of all, and it's not so much a writer as a journalist, a reporter, because there's a lot of similarities between what reporters do and what scientists do, especially investigative journalists. The idea is you're confronted with some controversy and you want to know what the truth is, and you want to establish that truth reliably. And in this case, we both came to it without preconceptions. So we had no biases. I spent the 1990s eating a low-fat, very low-fat, mostly plant diet, just like everyone else that I knew in my socioeconomic group did. That was the healthy way to eat. That's what the government was telling us to do. I started a series of investigations for Science, the journal Science, based just on the suspicion that there was an interesting story here. So I stumbled into this idea that the belief that salt causes high blood pressure. And I realized that there was an enormous controversy over this, which was something I believe that everyone agreed unanimously, and that there was a consensus in the scientific community, and it turned out there wasn't. And so I told my editor at Science that I wanted to try and figure out what was happening, and I just started talking to people. And again, without any biases, without being indoctrinated by the nutrition science, without being an academic who depends on grants and funding and the goodwill of my colleagues to further my career, I could just ask this question: what's the level of evidence for this belief, and why does this controversy exist, and who might be right? And then while I was doing that story, one of the worst scientists I'd ever interviewed, and my second book was called Bad Science. So I thought I had interviewed the worst scientists in the world. But one of the worst I'd ever interviewed took credit not just for getting Americans on this low salt diet we were eating, but on the low fat diet that I was eating. And I thought, this guy's a terrible scientist. That was clear just by the way he talked about the data and the evidence. And if he was involved in any substantive way, there was a story there. So coming at it as a journalist rather than a physician or a nutritionist or a dietitian or a chronic disease specialist, I could satisfy my curiosity without biases. As a journalist, you can interview everyone, which is, as a physician, with podcasts, it's getting easier to do that. You can actually email people and say, will you be on my podcast? And I can interview them. Right. But as a journalist, you're supposed to do that. And because these people get federal funding, they're supposed to talk to you. So you could call up the most influential people in the field. Back then, we called them first and say, I'm doing a story for Science, or I'm doing a story for the New York Times Magazine, and I'd like to talk to you about this. And they would want to help. So I'd have an opportunity to learn from the best. And while you're talking to people, you can also sort of press them. You can say, wait, I don't understand that, or this doesn't make sense to me. You can't do that when you're reading the papers, but you can do it when you're having a conversation. So journalists really have an advantage that scientists and physicians don't have. And, both Nina and I were sort of relentless in trying to get to what we consider the truth, just to keep asking questions and digging until we reached a point that we just weren't learning anything substantially new. So,
yeah, a lot of some of what you shared is part of how we were taught to be. We just don't really do it because we're too busy. I mean, even before our discussion today, just trying to manage a few video visits and a few meetings, and your life is so busy. Who has time to read studies, right? I mean, so it's really a different kind of experience. And I think there's a lot of barriers, and not that all the clinicians don't want to be this way. They struggle with it. So it's been one of the, and the only thing that's keeping me like aware is the fact that I'm kind of a student right now. So I'm relearning how to read studies. I'm relearning how to do all of these things. So it's helping me to kind of, get back into that mindset and to question everything.
But there's also, and questioning everything is critical, but there's different levels of expertise. So even when you're reading the studies, if you're reading a study in a field, like my pet peeve is this field of observational epidemiology. So that studies like the Nurses' Health Study at Harvard is the most famous, or the famous 7-country studies, where you ask a lot of people what they eat, and then you follow them for 10 years and see who gets sick and who doesn't, and see if you could create an association between what they eat. And there's all kinds of nuances to understanding those kind of studies that, in theory, the investigators are supposed to know best. Although in this field, it turns out they don't even care about it, which is one of the problems. But so you can read the study on one level, where you kind of understand what the investigator's doing and why they're doing it. But then there's an entirely different level of validity or non-validity about the conclusions they're drawing, that it really takes kind of an expert in that specialty to know. And they should be telling you about it. Their obligation when they write their paper should be to say every reason they could possibly imagine why their interpretation of the evidence might be incorrect. But if they do that, they won't get their papers published. Right. So they don't do that anymore. That used to be the way. So there's all kinds of levels of evidence. One of the advantages I had was that my first 2 books were about scientists who screwed up and discovered non-existent phenomena. And while I was writing those, I was being taught by good scientists why these guys had screwed up.
Right.
So that's really all I know is the difference between good science.
Do you have a system like I'm learning in school right now, they have like, system, like an approach. There's like questions you should ask yourself when you're looking at a study. Is there bias? Was the study appropriate? Blah, blah, blah. Do you have a systematic approach when you look at studies, or you just kind of know what to look for in general right now?
Well, it's interesting. Regrettably, I don't do anything very systematically, which is probably a serious flaw in my efficiency and why it takes me so long to do my books. Well, again, often, so I prefer talking to the scientists than I do reading the paper, because you can hide all kinds of sins in the paper anyway. So my general assumption is no paper published in the journals should be taken very seriously. More likely than not, it's either wrong or interpreted incorrectly. Again, it used to be, so I've become a student of the history of science. It used to be that if somebody did meaningful work, they might work on a subject for 10 or 15 years and publish 2 papers in 15 years. And the second one is the one you read, because that's the one where they finally think they got it right and they understood it and it's ironclad, and all their research partners, colleagues have criticized them.
Everybody's reviewed it, right?
Nowadays, you're supposed to publish like 5 to 10 papers a year, depending, and you've got all these researchers have postdocs and graduate students who are supposed to keep publishing. Even if the work isn't very good, they have to keep churning out papers. So you hear a lot about this replication crisis, but I think that's just sort of the nature of science. Most of the research, and in fact, when I was growing up 40 years ago, physicists used to say the assumption was 95% of what you read is worthless, and 5% is going to be meaningful science. And the problem is you got to fund it all, to get the 5% that's right, and you don't find out what that 5% is for another 10, 20 years. So, my general sense is, and, when you read my books, they have a real historical perspective. It's like, what can we really believe? What can we believe is very likely to be true based on 30-year periods of science? And then from that, how do we have to change it based on what we're reading now?
Right.
It's very complicated. And of course, because I come to a different perspective than the conventional wisdom, the question is why accept that I'm right and other people are wrong, except that as you find out as a doctor, if you apply the advice from my conclusions and Nina's conclusion, you get healthier patients. So that's a good sign.
Yeah, that helps. That's what's been the driving force for my practice. And I just talked to a patient a couple of days ago who we talked about the statins, and she was like, I just don't want to take these statins. And we talked about the rationale for not taking it. And I say, we have to collaborate, but you have a lot of information that your peers don't have, and a lot of the clinicians don't have. So we have to make a decision based on that totality of evidence. And I feel comfortable documenting your chart why we're not going to do the statins. And I think, but just be mindful that your clinician will probably get dinged if you don't get on a statin. It's just the nature of
modern medicine.
How we do business in this country. But you do remind me of the work you're doing beyond just writing books, and that's dealing with I know Nina has the Nutrition Coalition, and I know their purpose is to make sure nutrition policy is based on rigorous scientific evidence. But talk a little bit about the nutrition science initiative that you have. You kind of made me think of it as you was commenting. Tell the listeners what exactly that's all about.
Okay, so this is the Nutrition Science Initiative, NUSI for short.
Okay.
This was founded. I founded it with a physician, very, very smart guy named Peter Attia back in 2011, and Peter was the president and CEO. I was more a scientific advisor and consultant, but we were co-founders. But the idea was pretty simple. Or not simple. In my research, so I come along as a journalist. This was the other thing I was going to say about being a journalist in this field. We have these epidemics of obesity and diabetes, type 2 diabetes in this country and worldwide. They're out of control. We have despite public health advice aimed at controlling these epidemics for 50 years now, 40 years. There's no sign that they're under control. Every year, obesity rates continue to go up, diabetes rates continue to go up. So you could imagine that in a situation like this, if it was any other diseases but obesity and diabetes, where we could blame the patients and willpower and the food industry and everything but our advice, you might have teams of researchers, government panels convened to look through the evidence and see what we missed. For instance, if HIV/AIDS was as common today as it was 40 years ago and as deadly today as it was, 35 years ago, despite our belief that the HIV virus caused it and all the antiretroviral drugs and everything else, people would be questioning whether we made a mistake, right? If lung cancer rates were still going up, as since 1964, when we had the president's, the Surgeon General's report on smoking and lung cancer, if lung cancer rates were still going up and smoking still going down, people would say, maybe we made a mistake. Maybe it wasn't cigarettes. So in this case, in an ideal world, you would have the National Institutes of Health and the Health and Human Services convening panels saying, maybe we made a mistake. Maybe there's something about these diseases we don't understand. And it's never happened. And in part, it doesn't happen because the solution seems simple. We get type 2 diabetes because we're getting fatter, and we're getting fatter because we eat too much. So these are the sort of fundamental beliefs, and how could they possibly be wrong? And so nobody steps in to do this rigorous deep dive investigation to see if mistakes might have been made along the way by the research community such that we don't understand the nature of the disorders. So that's what Nina and I did. Two journalists stepped in and said, considering that we've completely failed to rein in these epidemics of obesity and diabetes, let's assume that maybe mistakes were made. Let's go see if we could find them. And when you go looking for them, they're easy to find and they're startling. And the biggest one is this idea that we get fat because we eat too much. So until 1930 specifically, there were two competing hypotheses for obesity. I mean, there was only, a half a dozen doctors in the world who actually thought about what causes obesity. And they were, every couple of years, somebody would write an article about obesity and they'd kind of review what we knew. But there were two general hypotheses. One is that it's caused by eating too much, gluttony and sloth, like this sort of biblical hypothesis. And the other was that it's a biological hormonal thing. Some people are just programmed to get fat, almost regardless of how much they eat. And then one University of Michigan physician comes in and he says, I've proven it definitively. It's all about eating too much. Obesity is always caused by eating too much. And what I documented in Good Calories, Bad Calories was how this eating too much hypothesis took over the field, to the point that by the 1980s, when obesity started to become a real, major source of scientific funding, researchers thought they were studying obesity when what they were trying and really studying was why people ate a lot or didn't eat a lot, hunger and satiety. So one of the arguments I made in Good Calories, Bad Calories is we fundamentally screwed up our thinking about obesity. It's not a eating too much disorder. I mean, we all know people who eat tremendous amounts of food and stay thin effortlessly. And we all know people who are obese who eat like birds and stay obese. It's got nothing to do with how much they eat. It's a hormonal problem, and the hormone insulin's at the heart of it. So
that's right.
For journalists to say that is kind of startling. It was sort of buried in this huge book, so it didn't get as much attention as it needed. But the other fact is it implied that the eating too much hypothesis was wrong, and you could test that.
Right.
And you could do rigorous scientific experiments. You'd have to use humans as subjects, so we'd call them clinical trials, but they were experiments. And if you could get the funding to do it and you did the experiments right, you could test the eating too much hypothesis. And I believed that if we could test it and refute it in independently replicated experiments, that we could convince the scientific community that they had screwed up. So with Dr. Attia, we co-founded this not-for-profit to fund those tests, and very quickly we got the support of a foundation in Texas that's run by a billionaire and his lawyer spouse, and they were behind us, and we funded a few studies, 4 studies, maybe 5. 2 of them aimed directly at testing this hypothesis, and those 2 got different answers. So the collaboration that didn't believe the hypothesis, got an answer that they argued refuted the hypothesis, and the collaboration which did believe the hypothesis got an answer which they argued supported it. And things got messy from there. And I joke that it was like the Hardy Boys started not-for-profit. We funded some very interesting research, but we did not resolve the scientific issue.
Yeah, and it looks like they got a lot of work to do.
Again, what's happening now is interesting, because now, without resolving it scientifically, we have a world of physicians like you who say, I don't need to know whether obesity is caused by overeating or this hormonal effect of insulin. I know that if I can get people off carbs, I can fix it and make people healthy. So that's the story I'm telling in The Case for Keto. My new book is basically the story of this bottom-up revolution. When I started Nusi, hoping we could, catalyze a top-down revolution.
Yeah. Trust me, I'm all for that. And I guess the question about The Case for Keto is, is this, how much of this is going to help clinicians see things differently versus the average person who's just trying to understand keto? I mean, who is this book really looking to target?
Well, I guess I am targeting clinicians. I'm hoping that people think, nothing I've tried has worked on my weight, and I'm pre-diabetic, right. I'm becoming diabetic. I have to do something. I hear about this keto thing. I'm ready to do it, or I've started doing it, and it seems to be working. And my physician is skeptical and thinks it's dangerous and a fad diet, and is unwilling to help. I know a physician who's got type 1 diabetes who was fired by his endocrinologist for doing a ketogenic diet with type 1 diabetes. That's, so I wrote the book. Originally, it was called How to Think About How to Eat, and then we had to change that title. But I wrote the book because I wanted people to understand this argument that I've been making, and others, that, it's not the calories that make you fat, it's the carbohydrates and the refined grains and sugars. And for those of us who really fatten easily, this term I borrowed from 1950s diet doctor, if you fatten easily, then carbohydrates are the problem and you're best off not eating them. It's kind of that simple. So it could have been a very short book, like 10 words.
Yeah.
But,
everything we do is easy. I always tell people, they come to me and they think I'm some miracle worker. I'm like, this is not rocket science. You get those, you carb restrict and miracles happen. It's really that simple for most people.
By the way, when you asked about what journalists bring to this, Nina and I, I had spent the 80s and 90s worrying about, bad science, controversial science, and physics. And I have a physics degree. So often I would have to write stories about things like quantum optics. And I would get, quantum optics gave me a headache, trying to understand what these guys were talking about, then trying to understand it well enough to simplify it for an article written for scientists. I would literally have to take Anacin every 4 hours while I was writing this is not rocket science. It's not quantum optics. So a reasonably smart journalist with some understanding of how science works can do this.
Yeah.
And then
it should be pretty straightforward.
Yeah. And then it comes down to, it's funny because something I talk about in the case for keto, because the advice we've been given for 50 years is wrong. Okay, eat less, exercise more, that'll solve it. That's the gluttony and sloth model, right? So that doesn't work. Or it works short time for people when they're young, and then so the dietitians and nutritionists, the chronic disease specialists have been confronted with this fact that no matter what advice they give people, their patients keep getting fatter, their clients keep getting heavier, and they see type 2 diabetes as a progressive chronic disease, and you're just supposed to keep changing the drugs, right? So up in the dose or shifting from oral, agent to oral agent until eventually you get into the complication problem and amputations and blindness.
It's very predictable.
Yeah. So they've had to create a whole slew of excuses, of rationalizations for why this fails, and why they can't even recommend it to people. What works, they can't recommend. So, it fails because nobody will stick with the diet. And the counter argument is, why would I bother sticking with the diet if it wasn't working for me? And why would I bother sticking with a diet where I'm hungry all the time and all I could do is think about food? And if you put me anywhere near a Cinnabon, I am going to binge, right? Another thing is you're never supposed to, you define an eating disorder by somebody who, one of the characteristics of an eating disorder is you restrict a whole food group.
Right.
So we're coming along and saying, well, for those of us who fatten easily or on this diabetes, downward slope, one of the problems is a whole food group for the most part. Right?
Right, basically.
Carbohydrates and sugars, so we can't eat those. But if we don't eat those, we'll be healthy.
Right.
And
it's hard for people to make sense of that. When I tell people they don't really have to eat fruit ever, they just look at you like, deer in the headlights. And I've been told my whole life to eat fruits and vegetables. And now you're saying, not only don't need to just cut down, I don't have to eat it at all. And I'm like, you really don't. And it's hard for clinicians to fully understand that until they see the successes that we're seeing. And in my whole career, I literally just never took people off medicine. I literally remember, and I've shared this before, I've been practicing, probably 24 years, but 28 years if you count your residency when you're officially a doctor. And in those years, I had one guy who was an athlete that, was on diabetes medicine and, got off and was doing his athlete thing, but really nobody else in my entire career. Right. And then like 7-8 years ago, I discovered this different way of eating, reducing the carbs, and like hundreds, it feels like hundreds. It's just like unlimited numbers of people. It's to the point now where it's more typical to see patients come in with their hemoglobin A1Cs 5, 6 or so, maybe 7, where it was always 8, 9, 10. It was always, and now it's like becoming normal. And now and I don't know if I'm better at convincing people, but it's just better. And so I just feel that there's so much territory for us all to cover. In fact, anybody who's watching or listening to this, it's important that we all play a role in this. I think we all have a role to play. And if you're seeing success in yourself or a family member, if you're a clinician, you're having success, it's really important that we share that with our colleagues. I work in a building and I need to do this better. It's 130 people in my building that I work in, and probably 45 to 50, clinicians come in and out of there. And I think it's important that we share these success stories. So I am curious. I was thinking about you talking about Nina and the life you guys live. So what is it like what's your day-to-day, other than, sneaking away to do a podcast? What's the life of a writer or journalist? How do you spend your day?
Oh, well, actually, let me say one thing. First of all, I want you to get copies of the Case for Keto and give them to all the clinicians and the nurses and the dietitians in the building.
Right. That's and
I will help you figure out how to pay for this. But that's exactly what I want to have happen. The point. So for that book, I interviewed over 120 some physicians. I missed you, I think. I estimate this out of a few tens of thousands of physicians who have now sort of converted to this way of thinking, right? So we're all indoctrinated, low fat, mostly plants, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, beans, and that's what you tell your patient, the Mediterranean diet or the DASH diet, and it doesn't work. So what does it take to switch? And it's funny, back in 1998, Malcolm Gladwell wrote a piece in the New Yorker about obesity. And he kind of joked about diet books, said they all have the same structure. And the structure is, well, I'm a doctor and I'm getting fat or I'm getting diabetic or I have some weird disease and I do everything I'm supposed to do and nothing works. And then I bury myself in the medical school library and I have all these dusty tomes and lo and behold, I find this idea and I try it and I'm cured. And then I try it on my patients and they're cured. Now I'm writing this book and I'm going to make a lot of money. So Malcolm Gladwell saw it as this kind of con story that's being told by the doctor to sell the book. But the problem is, of the 125 physicians I interviewed for my book, 125 of them went through some version of this experience, right? So if you're a lean, healthy doctor and you're running marathons every day and your patient population is lean, healthy, like affluent, fluent marathoners, what you're doing is working for you. And it's working for your patients, so there's nothing to learn, right? There's no conflict between what you've been taught and what seems to work. But if you're like the rest of us, who were doing what we were supposed to do and telling our patients, or I'm not a doctor, so telling your patients that you were thought they were supposed to do and it wasn't working, and you're getting heavier, you're getting diabetic, or you're pre-diabetic, or crippling arthritis or name your disease, then you start thinking, well, wait, I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to. I can't blame my patients for not following the advice because I'm the patient.
That's right.
So now you can have a learning experience, right? All science begins with an observation that's in conflict to what we expect. So now you try this different way of eating that you think is quackery, right? It's like, when I was younger, it was called Atkins. Now it's called keto. In between, it's had other names. So you try it and you think, and lo and behold, you get healthy. I mean, if you're obese, your excess weight goes away. If you're diabetic, your A1C comes down. If you're, arthritic, you find that your joints aren't as inflamed. And, it's sort of, if you're hypertensive, your blood pressure comes down. So that
Did you have a personal experience yourself that got you on this path as well? Did you really have
both Nina and I got on this path independent of the personal experience. So,
right, so it wasn't really
that. I was an athlete. I was a football player in college, a bad Division II football player, and I'm the kind of person who gets heavy. I was a defensive lineman, so we get heavier as we get older. I lived in LA in the 90s. I worked out an hour a day. I ran, I rollerbladed. I ate a healthy, low fat, mostly plant diet, and I was just getting heavier. And then when I did that second story I told you about on dietary fat for science, I was up at MIT interviewing an economist for another story I was working on. I started telling him about the dietary fat science. He said, if you're writing a piece on dietary fat, you got to try Atkins. He said his collaborator at the Wharton School of Business at, Philadelphia, said his collaborator's father did Atkins and lost 200 pounds. And this guy at MIT basically he's Asian American. He said, I basically gave up white rice. I lost 40 pounds. So I went back to California and I tried it, and it was somewhat remarkable. I mean, the whole eggs and bacon and a lot of animal products and green vegetables and salads, basically.
That's basically
it. I'd been gaining 2 pounds a year. I'd been on a diet, and in effect, always. You know what it's like. It's like you're always thinking, okay, I worked out today, so I don't have to, I could eat enough to satisfy me for dinner because I burned 500 calories, at the gym or on the beach, whatever, in LA. And suddenly it's like you flick a switch and you're just losing weight. It's like you used to gain weight, now you're losing weight. And for 6 weeks, I lost 25 pounds in 6 weeks. I didn't even exercise really, because I used to exercise to burn calories so that I could eat what I wanted to eat. And now I could eat what I wanted to eat anyway, except for the starches and grains. And what seemed like large, enormous portions. So every time somebody says, well, you eat less on these diets, I think, it's
not necessarily.
Right?
Well, you won't be hungry, but you will definitely. I eat a lot, and but I'm also, it's like a lot of steak, right? A lot of so it's like so maybe I'll eat less in theory, but I can pretty much eat as much as I want, and it seems like you don't gain a pound if you're eating the right
foods. It doesn't. That's how I feel. Like I can eat. It's funny, because I can still binge eat. There's still the guys, like when I was in high school with the football team, we used to go to this local restaurant called Emerson's in suburban Maryland, and Thursday night was all the steak you could eat. So, and all the beer you could drink. And the steaks got smaller and smaller as the evening went on, and they made sure that there was bad service for like the high school football kids who were clearly there too. But, I could eat 7 steaks then, and it was probably about 3 pounds of meat. And I could do the same now. I don't, but if I do, I don't worry about getting fatter. The way it's because it's just, I won't be that hungry the next day.
That's right.
My weight pretty much doesn't change as long as I don't eat. Yeah. So my experience, I've had people say, oh, well, he did Atkins. That's why he wrote his books. And it's like, I did this as an experiment, and I think everyone should, because it's fascinating. Yeah. And if you fatten easily, this could be the likely solution.
But I think that's great advice. Like, just do the experiment. I mean, you got, 2, 3, 4 months. just try it. Yeah. And if you don't feel great, if you don't lose weight or whatever your goals are, a lot of people, mental health gets better, the heartburn gets better, the autoimmune disease gets better.
Well, this is one of the reasons. One of the reasons the medical community thought that doctors like Atkins were quacks, right? It's because they would say things like that. Well, everything gets, the hair stops falling out, and then psoriasis goes away, and my acne clears up, and the halitosis gets better. I mean, but the fact is, and this is what I learned doing the research for Good Calories, Bad Calories, my first book, is that there had always been this theory that we basically didn't evolve to eat the carbohydrates in our diet. Certainly, some tubers here and there, like yams and sweet potatoes that hunter-gatherers would dig up, and then they'd have to soak them in a stream for 12 hours so that they could eat them without poisoning themselves, and then cook them. But for the most part, there's no bread, no pasta, no refined grains, no sugars at all, no Coca-Colas or orange juices or Cocoa Crisp cereals, and so you add these to a diet and you see this explosion of different sort of disease states.
Right. That's right.
And so what you're taking away when you're removing those carbs, and you got to replace the calories with something, so you replace it with fat for reasons it's easiest. All those diseases that manifest when you add these things that we didn't evolve to eat or we never ate, prior to 200 years ago, they go away because they're caused
just
by
go away. That's right.
Our bodies are just not designed to eat those foods, and when we do, they
not at all.
So
it gets. I think it gets to the root cause. Like if you think about it, understanding the root cause of why we get sick is really what. Even when you think about what I do with this whole protecting your nest acronym, nutrition, exercise, less stress, more sleep. It's really an acronym to remind people that these are the root causes of chronic disease. So if you just took diabetes, and I know you're doing research and writing about diabetes right now, the N in that nest really encourages us to focus on, what we eat. And in this case, we're encouraging a low carb diet. So we eat less of the carbs, more of the other macronutrients. And we also benefit from what Jason Fung would teach us, fasting's, so if you fast, you'll reverse diabetes very quickly. And he does it within a month with most of his patients. So, and then the S talks about stress reduction, getting enough sleep. And when you do that, you get enough sleep, you don't have stress, you don't have cortisol levels high, which will then lead to a lower sugar level, a glucose level. And then, of course, if you think a certain way, if my culture tells me to eat a certain way, even how we think may not always serve us. So even when you think about the research you're doing now for diabetes, are you finding that, are you discovering some of the root causes of why people become diabetic? I don't know how far along you are in that journey, but have you seen some explanations even beyond this whole dietary thing that we focus on?
I'm not looking that far. I only want, I only want to know about the diet connection for the most part. But even then, I get obsessed with the history, which is a problem because I'm writing a part of the book where I'm thinking, who's going to read this chapter other than me? But here you have.
Well, I do like history. You know what I like about history when I was a younger person, in school. History was boring because the teacher was boring, right. But history is like fascinating.
Well, if
it's taught properly.
If it's taught, and that's what I keep telling them. If it's just scary, you tell a good story, people will enjoy it, and if they learn something, great. Right. But until insulin was discovered, so diabetes is fundamentally this inability to metabolize the carbohydrates in the diet. And it's actually funny. I was interviewed for my new book, The Case for Keto, by a fellow for this website, sweetlife.org. And the reporter, who used to be a chef and is now a journalist, has type 1 diabetes. And he was telling me, so after he got done interviewing me, I said, I want to interview you for my book. And he was telling me the story of being diagnosed and seeing his endocrinologist. And he says to his endocrinologist, so let me get this straight. for me, carbohydrates are poison, and insulin is like the antidote. So if I eat the poison, I got to take the antidote. Why don't I just not eat the poison?
Right.
And this is the whole history of diabetes in a nutshell. He captured, and now that's what he was telling me is now what's called the epigraph, this little, quote at the beginning of the book.
Sure.
They got this disorder where you can't metabolize carbohydrates. And so until 1921, when insulin's discovered, the diet is don't eat carbohydrates. They basically called it an animal diet. So it was fatty meats and green vegetables. And you'd boil the green vegetables 3 times to get all the carbs out of it, which also removed all the vitamins. They didn't know that, but it did. And you could keep patients with type 2 diabetes alive indefinitely. They didn't need any oral hypoglycemic agents or anything. They just, boom, don't eat carbs. And then insulin comes along, and with insulin, you create hypoglycemia, so low blood sugar, right? That doesn't really exist without insulin. So
it just, for the most part, it's rare.
Yeah, no, and the researchers who discovered insulin, like they chronicled the first case of it in one of their dog experiments. Like they gave the dog insulin and it started to shake and sweat, and So now you got to give them carbohydrates. So now you force everybody to take the antidote, and then you got to give them the poison.
That's right.
And make them eat the poison. And it just gets crazier and crazier as the century goes on, where we're going to give them more and more of the carbs and more of the drugs. And then in the 1960s, a story I and Nina tell about why, once you buy into dietary fat causes heart disease. Now we can't give you fat, so we got to give you even more carbs and more drugs. And it's like, dude, just don't eat the poison.
And I think that's key, though. And I sympathize with my colleagues because they were in a conundrum. They were forced to fear LDL cholesterol and fat so much that they felt like they didn't have a choice. And even while I'm training in nutrition right now, there's still this emphasis on grains. And, you have to, because we're doing toxicology now, you have to have the grains to remove the toxins. And the question becomes, if you eat properly, you may not have a lot of toxins to remove, to be honest. So it should be fairly obvious, but it is a little strange that something so obvious should be obvious to these brilliant clinicians out here and dietitians out here who should be able to understand the basic principle. Don't eat the poison. We can call that a toxin as well. And then if you do that, you won't need the medicine. And this, we've been doing this backwards for so long. My assumption is that they have not heard this stated in clear terms. And because they haven't heard it, they haven't changed. Now, if you hear this and you don't change, or at least test this hypothesis, then shame on you. I just think it's so obvious.
That's where the conversion experience comes in. Because they hear it once and you decide, it's like, look, the response is, remember, I told you they have all these kind of built-in defense mechanisms, like an immune system to protect their belief system. So part of it is this is a multifactorial complex problem. There is no simple solution. Trust us. So anyone who says there's a simple solution is a quack who's trying to sell you something. If there were a simple solution, nobody wants to stick with it. So you can't tell people don't eat carbohydrates because that's unsustainable. People are going to eat carbohydrates. And then if you tell them don't eat carbohydrates and they eat carbohydrates and they're not taking insulin, they're going to be in trouble. So let's tell them to take the carbohydrates and take the insulin. And that way there's no way they can cheat and be in trouble. Now, all kinds of chronic complications to having high blood sugar and taking insulin, but we've got drugs for that. So there's all these sort of they've got a defense mechanism. And so I really think the only way it changes, some of the better doctors, if they see enough of their patients, like a cardiologist who's got patients who go to you, and then you make them healthy. And the first time it happens, the patient goes to the cardiologist says, geez, Ellen, you've lost I'm looking at your chart, you lost 60 pounds. What are you doing? She says, well, I'm on a low carb diet. And the guy goes, oh, like Atkins? Don't do that. And then, let's measure your LDL cholesterol and get you off that diet. And then a couple of weeks later, the same thing happens. And eventually, after a while, they might say, this is interesting because these people really do seem to be a lot healthier than they used to be, even regardless of what's happening to LDL. The other thing is, in the ideal world, the doctor himself or herself is getting heavier and struggling with it. And then they have to decide, because you can't just, it's hard to tell your patients to do it if you haven't done it yourself.
Yeah. Right? Well, Dr. Tro was on the podcast recently, and he lost 150 pounds. And one of the things he talked about was, hunger was his focus. And it kind of goes back to, people saying it's not sustainable. I think, first of all, low carb or keto diet is easier because I can eat those delicious steaks I love. But he talked about he actually tries to problem solve with his patients and figure out, why they get hungry and really focusing on that. And I think in your book, I saw that, you actually talk about hunger. So how big of a role is hunger as you've interviewed all these clinicians and them trying to help their patients?
Well, there's two different ways to think of hunger. I mean, there are multiple different ways to think of hunger, but so the way we've been trained to think of it is it's sort of, the foods that you eat have certain satiety values. Some foods are satiating, they fill up your stomach, they're energy dense or nutrient dense, and maybe they fill up your stomach and they're slow to digest, and therefore you eat smaller meals or you eat, The other way to think about it is it's a response to sort of the fuel available to your cells below your neck. So if your cells in your body are well fed, particularly in your liver, then you're not going to be hungry. And if they're not, if they sense that there's a failure in the food supply, because your brain is protected from food shortages. We have this very wonderful system, the ketones and ketogenesis. So you could fast for weeks and not be hungry in your brain because it's living off ketones from your fat tissue and glycerol from your fat and all that. So the idea is your cells in your body are responding to fuel availability. And if they sense that, like a gas tank, that you're running out of gas, then they generate basically hunger. Or so when you're eating a high carb diet and you're storing calories as fat and you can't access those calories, that's why you're hungry all the time. That's why your blood sugar drops so low, because as it comes down, you should mobilize the fat you've stored and then burn the fat instead of the carbs. And when your body's working, ideally, it's what research called you have fuel flexibility. You go from burning carbs immediately after a meal to burning fat, to burning carbs, to burning fat, to burning carbs. If you're insulin resistant, like what diabetes is and obesity more or less is, then you can't access the fat. So you eat carbs, you store the fat, and then you burn through the carbs and your blood sugar comes down and you can't access the fat because your insulin's still elevated. So now you got to eat. So you're hungry all the time.
Yeah.
The other way, you're like, you burn fat just all day long. Nice steady supply of fuel from the fat you store, the fat you're eating. It's your body's perfectly. So there's still other triggers that might trigger eating behavior, but for the most part, you're just satisfied because the cells in your body they know there's plenty of fuel there. It's like the fuel lines are open. We're burning what it's given us. There's nothing blocking it. There's no, anyway, that's kind of the deal. So,
and it's a good feeling, man. I mean, again, I was fortunate and I got into this low carb space looking at what was happening with family and patients. And I've never had a weight issue, but I'm going to tell you, I've never felt better. And it's just weird when food is like an afterthought. There are many days when you have to remind yourself you should eat, you're not really thinking about it because you're not really hungry. And that's not being in a, people think, well, you have to have a lot of fat on you. Well, we all have fat and there's plenty to achieve the goals. And I just think this idea of not being hungry is one of the greatest rewards of eating this way. But the other part, and the other thing that I want you to comment on is this idea of, what about, blaming people for being overweight? And, as you've interviewed all these clinicians for your book, do you think clinicians really understand the importance of not blaming people? Because we've given them such horrible advice for so long.
Well, remember,
it's hard to look at them,
Yeah, I'm interviewing the physicians who have converted, so they get it. These people, my patients didn't fail because they were lazy or because they didn't pay attention or they didn't care, or they lacked willpower. They failed because I was giving them the wrong advice.
Right.
Okay. Now, when I give them the right advice and they're suitably motivated, which is diabetes is a great motivator. The specter of having to inject yourself with insulin is a terrific motivator to getting healthy.
Yeah.
Then they do the right thing, and then it's easy. The point I make in this book is the whole way we think about obesity, this energy balance idea, this idea that's caused by taking in more calories than you expend, blames the person with obesity for the problem, because these are eating too much and sedentary behavior are both behaviors. They're not physiological disorders. Like if someone's grown to be 8 feet tall and weighs 400 pounds, we know that person has a hormonal disorder. We don't even care that they weigh 400 pounds. We don't care how much they eat and exercise. We know it's a hormonal issue. But if they're 6 feet tall and weigh 400 pounds, then it's about how much they eat and exercise. Then it's a behavioral issue. Then we implicitly blame them because if it's behavior, they should be able to fix it. You should be able to, if you're eating too much, you should be able to eat less. If you're not sedentary, just go to the gym. And so all of the fat shaming, to me, that is so prevalent in our society, to me, comes directly from this theory, this crazy, stupid idea that people get fat because they eat too much. That's not why they get fat.
Right. It's not. Well, clearly we've kind of disclosed that we sometimes eat plenty and it's not happening. So for anybody who has struggled, who's, listening today, please just give yourself a chance to not struggle. And, I think about my website, which is, drtonyhampton.com. And, when I first started thinking about what to put on that website, I was going to do low carb, I was going to do keto, and I'm sure you've had to wrestle with those names yourself. So when you think about like those terms, right? And let me tell you one of the reasons why I decided to go with metabolic health, because I'm probably in what's the top 10 health system in the country with Advocate Aurora. And part of my journey is to engage people. I'm very comfortable with keto, low carb, even carnivore. But I just felt like if I could message the ultimate goal is to achieve metabolic health. Now, there are some people, and Nina Teichos would argue maybe 12% of the population is metabolically healthy. So for those people, they can do, those other diets quite effectively. But what I found is that most Americans, 88% or so, based on how she would frame it, they need to consider carb restriction. But when you decided to write your book and you came up with the title you came up with, and I know back when you started this journey, it was probably a little more drama associated with the term than today. Is actually becoming popular. Was there any apprehension about using that terminology versus metabolic health or low carb? I mean, what was going through your head?
So the current title is A Case for Keto, and then the subtitle, Rethinking Weight Control and the Science and Practice of Low Carb, High Fat Eating. So I'm getting them both in.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, and in the book, I refer to it as low carb, high fat / ketogenic eating. So LCH, and I say, look, this is going to trip off nobody's tongue. But so I don't know how I feel about the title. Like I said, originally this book was called How to Think About How to Eat, and it was a sort of healthy weight manifesto. Mm-hmm. And the idea is, let's get rid of this energy balance craziness. There's calories in, calories out. This is a hormonal issue. People have to fix the hormones involved. Insulin dominates. You got to lower insulin. You lower insulin, you'll be fine. Or you'll be as healthy as you could be. And so there are all these simple messages. Like I said, we couldn't use the title, How to Think About How to Eat, because too influential, a doctor and a food writer had a book coming out a month before mine called How to Eat. And they were arguing entirely different things. Actually, there's a lot of overlap. So we had to change my title. And my previous book was called The Case Against Sugar. And so somebody at the publisher said, how about the case for keto? In retrospect, I find it disturbing because I'm not actually arguing that, I've had interviews where reporters have said to me, so you think everybody should be on a ketogenic diet? And it's like, did you read the book? And the answer is no, they didn't. They saw the title and they assume I'm, right. It's a viral word, keto. It's supposed to draw people to the book, but it's really about how to think about achieving metabolic health and what you have to do to get there and how you have to think about it. And the step one is carbohydrates are the problem. Refined grains and sugars are the problem. Don't eat those.
That's right. I think it's that simple, and it's been the secret sauce for me and my patients, and I hope the people who are listening that they would also benefit. I know a lot of times when you have these interactions, a large percentage of the people listening are already, they're already sold and they already get it, but we just want to reach as many people as possible. And I really just am grateful that you're doing that work. Do you have a true north? Do you have if you could see the world in 5 years or 10 years, what would it look like as it relates to the work you're doing?
I don't think we're going to get there in 5 or 10 years, but and we used to ask this question at NUSI, my not-for-profit, what would constitute success? So success is you're a parent, you have an adolescent who's fighting with his or her weight and losing that battle. And everyone in that child's life understands what has to be done to succeed and supports it. And whether or not the child wants to make the sacrifices it thinks it's worth it, maybe he or she might not want to do it till they're adults, maybe not even then. But we understand. Remember, I told you, we've got these out of control epidemics. And we believe the fundamental belief, Newton's laws of obesity research, is we get fat because we eat too much. And as long as that's what we believe, we are never going to solve these problems. And so the 10 years from now, we get it. We understand that it's not a behavioral issue. It's not a calories in, calories out issue. These are hormonal dysregulations. And if we understand that, we can fix it. And even the pharmaceutical industry, if they understand that, they can fix it. They're not trying. They think that it's all about getting people with obesity to eat less. Even when they have a drug that might work, they assume it works, not because they have strong evidence, but they assume it works because they get people to eat less. Like it's a behavioral drug, not a physiology drug. So that's kind of my dream. That's why I keep writing these books. There's 2 more books. I want to write the diabetes book, and then I want to write a book about this sort of the history of obesity research that I'm going to call, at the moment, the title is A History of a Very Bad Idea. And it's a history of this energy balance, gluttony, and sloth thinking, and how obesity researchers just embrace something that was obvious, and it's just so wrong and so damaging. That's, and then I think people can start, they'll know what they have to do to fix it. And then all kinds of good things should come from that. Like we could know.
I think it will. I think the work you guys have laid out for us really helps, and we needed it. And I guess you've helped a lot of people. Nina has done the same. When you think about yourself, my little acronym, nest and rope, right? So nutrition, we talked about how it's about the food and maybe fasting for some of us, eat for exercise. I actually wasn't exercising regularly until about 2 years ago. And I feel like so much better doing it. I didn't master sleep, which is the S, until a year ago. And now as a busy clinician, I have to get 7 hours, and I feel completely different having done that. Of course, stress reduction. My mom fusses about, you got to know what's going on. You have a nice car. And I say, Mom, I'll watch. So I honored her, and I watched the news about the carjacking. And I couldn't that day I was paranoid. And I told my mom that night, I said, Mom, I'm not going to watch the news. I'm going to be safe because it's, that's not, and then the T is for how we think, which is similar to that and avoiding trauma. But the R is for relationships, avoiding organisms, COVID, right? Pollutants, which is our environment, what we put in our mouth. And then the E is for emotions, protecting our emotions and our life experiences that we keep the ones that serve us. So when you think about that acronym, right, you think about your personal journey, are there areas that you really want to focus on yourself that's going to keep you around so you can keep delivering this great content?
Sleep and stress, yes.
Yes.
Part of, I think, the struggle with trying to convince the medical research community that they made a mistake is, the natural assumption is that you're a quack or a whack job, right, which I think is a technical term for those of us who aren't doctors. And so you're constantly fighting against the establishment, and nobody likes to be told that they're wrong. So for the most part, I get a lot of positive feedback from folks like you and then the website, but the medical research community doesn't, they would just assume I go away. So there's a lot of stress reduction techniques. I mean, I meditate and things like that. I, hypnotize myself into not caring that there's a lot of negativity from people. Nobody wants to be told they're wrong, and the message is you're wrong, right, and that's a conflict that I have to be able to deal with every day, and ideally, stay sane and happy, and my family helps for sure, and the COVID and that ongoing endless nightmare, and all of that requires sort of stress reduction techniques. Sleeping, I used to sleep really well. I don't know what happened the past year. It's been an interesting experience, and I'm keep trying different tweaks, hacks to find a drug-free way to get a good night's sleep.
Right. Well, that's the ideal. I try, I do pretty well in that department, but I try, I got the little app, I think it's Calm. And I said, let me just see. And I think for me, that won't work because the calming sounds that they offer to me keeps my mind focused on the, to me, it doesn't work. But then I've heard my patients say it does work. So I think I think what you're doing is your own little personal, your N of one experiment, and you just got to keep playing around with it. I hope that gets better because I have to say it's definitely, when you get that sleep, it's an amazing thing.
But there's also, there's a kind of positive or negative feedback loop. As you can get your stress under control, you sleep better, you get more work done, you feel better about yourself, you get... I told you I'm writing a chapter in the diabetes book about this crucial 8-year period before the discovery of insulin from 1913 to 1921, and it fascinates me, and it's very complex, and it's full of contradictions, and I want to talk about this, and yet I keep thinking, wait a minute, I mean, how many of the 30 million diabetics in America will want to read about this? And okay, well, if I tell a good enough story and the writing is good enough, they'll read it. So I just have to do that. And so I get all bound up with, conflict and stress. And if I can get that chapter done and I can move on, and then I'll sleep better. So it's all, but it's all interesting. It's all N of ones. It's all
everything.
I have a friend in Los Angeles who's a very new agey kind of LA guy, and he's got all kinds of homeopathic physicians he goes to. And his father died. His father had, type 2 diabetes and was obese and ran a candy store in Brooklyn and died of a heart attack at early 50s. So this friend of mine is very health conscious because he doesn't want to go that way. And we were talking about this stuff, and he said, well, his homeopath said that she knows some people who sleep better if they have raisins before they go to bed. So I am the last person in the world who will say good things about a carbohydrate, but I have a sleep problem.
Right.
So I'll try the raisins, a handful of them, not a handful, like a teaspoonful of raisins. If I sleep better, it'll be interesting to see, will it affect my weight if I have raisins? I don't know. Maybe I tend to do time-restricted eating, so I try not to eat after 8 o'clock at night.
It probably won't.
Probably won't.
Like, if you think, it probably won't. I mean, I think that it would be disingenuous of you or me to hear of something that could work. We just spent this last hour trying to convince people to consider keto. And then if somebody gives you something that's fairly safe that you can do in the short term, or N of one, why not? And there's probably, as a scientist, I'd be curious what's in a raisin that would do that would benefit. But I'm 100% happy to try that experiment.
Well,
and you have
I have a friend who say, well, if you sleep better, how do you know it's not a placebo effect? And my response is, I don't care if it's a placebo effect. I'm all for a great placebo. If it works, the only problem is if I start taking it and I sleep better, and then a month from now I stop. Now I go back to just as bad, but now I'm sleeping just as badly with raisins instead of without.
Right.
Now, and that's a trouble. That's a problem with any drug you take, anything, So if that happens, then you have to think through it. And then when I wrote I
would worry about it. Yeah. Just worry about it then. I would just, try to experiment.
And it's got to be benign, right? Nobody died from eating a teaspoonful of raisins.
See how to. Yeah, I mean, I tell patients all the time, dried fruit is like eating, candy, but a handful of raisins, and a guy who, most days I'm probably literally 15 to 20 carbs, Grams, so who cares, add those, whatever.
Yeah, there's also, sun-made raisins, the golden raisins are not sweet. So they're not like the black ones, which taste like candy. They're barely sweet to a guy who doesn't eat sugar. So that's to somebody else, they're not sweet at all. So I think it's just a probably low glycemic index, fiber-rich source of a trickle of carbs while you're sleeping. But again, I don't know if it's going to work. So
yeah, I love it.
Yeah,
I love the idea of it. So as we kind of wrap up, any final words of wisdom that you would share?
Yeah, just the case for keto, the new book. I mean, I wrote that to convince, like I said, physicians and lay people, patients, anyone struggling with their weight, their blood sugar, their blood pressure, to understand what we're saying here about carbohydrates and insulin being the problem. And here's a reason why you should give it a try. And if you give it a try, here's how to think about it so you do it right. Because we all know people who say, I have an email waiting from me from a guy who wants my advice because keto hasn't been working for him, but he's only been doing it 5 days a week. So do I think he should do it 7?
Yeah, that'll probably be the first piece of advice.
Yeah, so it's sort of, I want people to, and by getting to talk to all these physicians, guys like you, I could say, what's the challenge is, how do you get this across to your patients? What's the challenges of the patients? So I could, there's, a lot of really smart men and women out there who just want to make their patients healthy, and now they found a way to do it, and so I could benefit from what they've taught. So that's sort of when I call it how to think about how to eat, it's sort of how to think about how to achieve metabolic health, like I said. And this part of it is self-experimentation. We all try this, do it right, give it enough time to see if it's working for you. Ideally, you do it with a good physician so you get help and understanding, and you can do the lipid tests and the blood tests so you could see that you're getting healthier. And if you do, then why not keep it going? Because you're not sustaining the diet, right? You're trying to sustain the health that we get from eating this way.
It feels good. And metabolic health is just feeling good. You look better. Everything about your life gets better. And So no matter why you're on the planet, if it's just to be a great grandfather, or grandmother, or, to do really well in your corporation, whatever you're doing, you're going to be better at it. So it's just worth giving it a shot. And I just want to encourage everybody to do that. I definitely encourage everyone to consider your great book. And I'm just happy we have another resource like that. And of course, I know you're cutting down on some of your activity on social media, but where would people find you beyond, Amazon, I'm sure, for your book, and any other places where people can find you?
Well, I tweet Gary Taubes. I always tend to regret it, but it's too easy to get in conversations with people. Too many people are trying to provoke you. But
I think it's a lot of provoking. In fact, I had to be told when I started my social media, don't take anything personal, because you can tell when people are just poking at you a little bit.
And that's some people just gives them joy. Anyway, and then I have a website, Gary Taubes, TAUBES.com. I don't post very often on it, but anyone who wants to read the book can go to the website and get the first chapter free.
Absolutely.
So,
I like that.
And if you don't want to read it after the first chapter, then I didn't do my job. So
that's right. Well, for me, it was definitely an interview I was looking forward to. It's surreal for me to have an opportunity to interact with the people who have really changed how I practice. So I want to thank you for that. And I'm sure people who are listening in, checking us out, feel the same way. So that's why I wanted to start the conversation, mentioning not just you, but Nina, because I feel like you guys have really made a difference. I really appreciate you. Thank you for being here. And, I just appreciate you. So I just want to say that one more time. So, wow. So as we kind of wrap up this edition, guys, of Protecting Your Nest, I really want to, again, celebrate the work of two writers. We got Gary and Nina, who helped create awareness that maybe there's a logical reason why so many people in the country are suffering from chronic medical conditions. Their contribution, it was exactly what we needed to get us to the path of healing. So now I have a favor to ask you, which I suggested earlier, and that's everyone listening. Now that our journalists have given us this solid foundation, let's all work together to share this great message that healing from chronic metabolic dysfunction is possible. We can actually heal from that. So let's do our part to essentially help other people protect their nest. So And that could be our contribution to the world, our contribution to the concept of wellness for everybody. So I appreciate everybody that listened in today. I thank you for spending time with us. And as I always say, I ask that you stay well, stay safe, and continue to protect your nest. You've been listening to Protecting Your Nest with Dr. Tony Hampton. For more, visit drtonyhampton.com.